Want to learn how to write an effective grant application for a nonprofit organization? It starts with understanding each of the sections that you're likely to encounter in a typical grant application. In this new video on this topic, I'm going to take you section by section and what you would find in a typical grant proposal, explain what each is looking for, and share some tips on how to write them. Welcome back. I'm Amber Melanie Smith. I'm a nonprofit founder and executive director, and I make these videos here on YouTube all about nonprofits, social impact, fundraising, leadership, and more. As always, I hope that you find this video is helpful and useful. Don't forget to give it a like and thumbs up, and give it a thumbs up. Give it a thumbs up. And subscribe to my channel for more content like this. If you're looking for some extra guidance and support, check out my website, foundertofulltime.com, where I have 2 online courses, one about starting a nonprofit, and the second one, relevant to this topic, about developing a sustainable fundraising plan. So I hope that you find this helpful and you can check those out there. I've talked about this in some of my other fundraising related videos, but grants are just one of many ways that nonprofits can generate revenue. And they can be a little bit challenging to get because they're highly competitive. Lots of people assume grants are like the top way nonprofits get funding, and so you get lots of applications, and there are lots of ways. But since we're talking about grant funding in this video, I want to give you the best odds of success possible when you do submit a grant application. And like I said in my intro, that starts with understanding the sections and really getting in the minds of the grant funders to understand what they are asking for and what they are looking for in each of these sections. I'm going to talk through 7 common sections that you would find in a typical nonprofit grant application. And I'll start with number 1, the executive summary. The executive summary is a section that you'll find at the very beginning of a grant proposal narrative. And it's something that you actually want to write last after you've written the rest of your grant application, because you're going to pull in probably some text from the other sections of your grant proposal to put into the executive summary. But basically what this is it's a brief overview of the organization and the proposed project or program. This is the first thing the grant maker reads, so you really want to make it crisp and concise and clear. And what they are looking for, like I said, is the key points of what they're going to read in the rest of the application. So your organization's mission, a sentence or 2 about the proposed project, and especially its intended impacts if funding is received. At the end of writing the rest of your grant proposal, you want to really pay special attention to this executive summary because, as I said, it's the first thing grant makers are going to read. And if something in that top section disqualifies you somehow from getting a grant, they won't read the rest of the application. So make sure it's really in great shape, that it's very clear, and that you have some great, compelling intro sentences that grip them like you're reading a good novel. Section number 2 that I'm going to talk about is the organization's background. Now, you might reiterate your mission statement in this section, but the grant maker is especially looking for sort of the history and the foundation of success for your organization. They might ask you questions about your organization's leadership, its structure, its history, its current programs, but especially your track record of success. Basically, this is where you can showcase your organization's credibility and authority for being able to execute on the program to meet its goals if you get the funding. Depending on the space you have in your proposal and how in-depth you want to get here, you might include something like a timeline of your organization, like the year it was founded, then years where large accomplishments or key milestones occurred, like the launch of a special program, or the year you reached 1,000 people served, or something like that. You might also include a sentence or 2 about your organization's key leadership and their credentials, essentially. What makes them the right person to fulfill this organization's mission? What knowledge and experience do they have? What brought them to this work? Maybe it's a health-related nonprofit and the founder is a surgeon. That might be relevant because then you're demonstrating that that founder has intimate knowledge of the cause. The third section of your grant proposal is probably the most important, and that is your need statement. In this section, you are going to paint a compelling picture about the problem that your organization's program or project is aiming to solve. Maybe it's a rise in homelessness in your city, or the fact that a certain percentage of kids in your community are going to bed hungry. Whatever the problem is, in this section, you need to demonstrate that you have a clear knowledge of it and expertise in explaining it. You want to include some data and statistics about the problem, especially as it relates to the geographical area that your organization serves. You might also, if you have space, include a short anecdote or story about someone who has lived through this problem. But especially you want to make sure that in this section you are explaining how the project or the program that you're seeking funding for is proven or highly likely based on past research to legitimately address the problem that you're describing, that you have good reason to believe that what you're doing as a nonprofit is a reasonable solution to that problem. You might demonstrate this by showcasing past feedback of participants who've gone through your program and gotten the help that they need. You might showcase research from similar programs in other cities that shows that when you do that kind of program, you get these positive results. There are lots of ways to do it, and I understand that newer organizations might have a hard time showing the impacts of the past because they might not have as many yet and they're just getting started. But using research from similar organizations who are doing similar work is another way to show the efficacy of what you're trying to do. In the fourth section, you're going to get into a lot more detail about the project or program you're seeking funding for. In this section, you're going to describe your program fully. You're going to explain how it works, what activities are a part of it, the strategy and the mindset behind you running the program in that way, a timeline. So is it a program that is ongoing? Does it happen in one season of the year? Is it happening in a specific week? What are the steps you take throughout the year to lead up to that? So what is your whole planning timeline? And then, as I mentioned before, sharing your expected outcomes. So the impacts you think you'll be able to make if you're able to get that funding. And like I said before, the grant maker wants to see evidence that the proposed project or program has a strong chance of meeting the outcomes and impacts that you have stated. And showcasing that through all the different ways we talked about before, participant feedback, other research, etc. I also want to take a moment to explain the difference between outputs and outcomes. An output might be something like number of meals served or number of adoptable animals served, stuff like that. An output is basically a product of the action you're taking. That's different though from an outcome. An outcome is how the situation changed from beginning to end. So from status quo to you come in and do your work, and then after that, what was the change? Think of it like a before and after picture for a social problem, right? So an outcome would be of the number of people that you fed meals to, what percent are no longer food insecure? So that's like a change in their lives as a result of working with you. Or in the case of the animal adoptions that I mentioned, what percent of animals are in their homes permanently after a year or two? Because sometimes animals get returned to the shelter. So how good of a job is your organization doing matching animals to their correct or to the best fit home, and so that they stay in that home? That's an outcome versus an output. Grant makers might want to see both outputs and outcomes, but they're especially interested in outcomes because they want to know, what difference will their money make? If they don't give you money, will you be able to achieve anything or achieve everything anyway? Or if they give you the funding, how many lives are you going to change in that before and after scenario? Common section number 5 is your organization's evaluation plan. And this is basically where you describe your process and plan for evaluating the effectiveness of the project or program that was funded. Are you going to do surveys of the people who participated? Are you going to track how many people were served and in what ways? Basically, how are you going to prove, like we talked about before, that your program was effective in doing what you said it was going to do if funding was received? So in this section, they're going to ask you, what are you measuring? And especially, how are you going to measure it? Literally, what tools are you using? If it's a survey, say a survey. You can even say the name of the technology or software you're going to use to collect the surveys and the process you're going to go to make sure that surveys are completed. So really talking about your plan here, and the funder wants to know that it's reasonable, it's achievable, and that it's going to really showcase the intended data. And on another note, funding aside, you should have evaluation systems in place anyway, because you're starting a nonprofit, you're running a nonprofit, you're seeking grant funding in order to make a difference in the world. And I know for me, I want to know if I'm actually making a difference or if the things that I'm doing are ineffective, because if they are, I want to change what I'm doing. So evaluation and collecting important data really helps you be able to do that. The next section that you are extremely likely to find in grant proposals is the budget section. And the budget section could be one of two things or both of these things. It could be asking you for your organization's total annual budget, or it could be asking for just the budget related to that specific project or program seeking funding. Of course, the budget is going to outline the intended expenses, what you're going to spend money on for that project or program or for your organization, and the revenue that you expect to bring in. And you're going to show all of the revenue that is connected to your organization if they're asking for your organization's budget, or if they're just asking for the project or program budget, the revenue attached to that program. And typically you don't want to ask for a grant to cover 100% of your program or project's expenses. In my experience, that is likely to get rejected because the grant maker wants to see that they are not the only funder that has an interest in or is willing to invest in your program or project. So in my experience, a good rule of thumb is to never ask for more than 30 to 40% at the highest of your program or project's entire budget from a single funder. An exception would be if a funder comes to you and says, I want to fund this, what's it going to take? In which case, if they want to fund all of it, great, more power to you. So anyway, you want to have this this budget ready to go, and if it's your organization budget, you hopefully already have that ready to go from your ongoing operations anyway. They're gonna look for a realistic and detailed budget that doesn't seem completely, unachievable. And they're gonna wanna look for in the revenue section the other groups or individuals who are investing in that program or project as well, to make up the rest of the funding that you said you needed to fund this program fully. A word on direct versus indirect costs. They might ask you in the grant application, okay, showcase what your direct costs are and then list what your indirect costs are for this program or project. If you're not already familiar with direct versus indirect costs, think of it like this. What are the items, services, or staffing or equipment that you need to make sure that your program or project happens? They are directly related to your program or project. That's your direct costs. So it would be things like, let's say it's an animal rescue organization, your animal adoption coordinator staff. That's a direct cost. You can't run your adoption program without that coordinator staffing it and coordinating everything. In this example, other direct costs might include the food you feed the adoptable animals. It could be the housing for the animals. That's a direct cost. So things like that are like directly touching the program and its outcomes. Now, indirect costs are the operational costs that your organization still has to cover somehow in order to be able to do all these programs. A common example is keeping your lights on. You have to have electricity and pay your utilities bill in order to run an animal rescue agency. So even though the electricity isn't something that's directly touching the process of adopting out animals, you still need it. So listing it out and explaining that though it's an indirect cost, it's still a very necessary cost in order to run your programs, really helps clarify the full true needs of the costs of your program to potential funders. Okay, section number 7, and the last one I'll talk about today in this video is your sustainability plan. So in this section, you're going to want to describe your plan for how you're going to continue covering the costs of your program or project after that funder's grant has been used, after that grant cycle is complete. The grant maker wants to see that you have, like I said before, other interest from other funders, that you have a plan for how you're going to generate revenue in order to sustain the program beyond the money they give you. Perhaps you're using a portion of the grant to invest in an earned income revenue strategy that will perpetuate the program after the grant funding. If you don't know what earned income is, check out my video on earned income in my fundraising playlist. That will help you kind of understand what that is and how that works. Unfortunately, grant makers usually don't want to provide year after year funding to the same organizations. They don't want you to rely on them. There's lots of dialogue about whether that's good or not, but that is currently how it is. So just be aware of that, that you should be thinking about your plan to bring in other sources of funding outside of this one grant. All right, I'd love to hear from you. What parts of a typical grant proposal do you find or do you think you would find the easiest to write or to develop? And which sections do you think are the hardest? Share in the comments below. As I mentioned before, if you are starting a nonprofit or developing a sustainable fundraising plan, check out my website for my courses and my resources, foundertofulltime.com. And if you're looking for other resources for changemakers or nonprofits, I have a great monthly newsletter that I send out with some reading on the latest trends in social impact, some funding opportunities that I come across, and more. You can learn about that and subscribe to that using the link below this video. Finally, if you're on Facebook, I have a group called Change the World or Bust. We've got thousands of people from around the world in there, all making an impact, and I encourage you to come out and join us and join that group. So I hope to see you there. Once again, I'm Amber Melanie Smith. I hope that you found this helpful. Don't forget to give it a like and a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Bye.